So I'd like to introduce you to this morning to the start. We're going to talk about the Reconstruction in the New Iberia and post-war in New Iberia. And so I'm going to introduce the speaker, and then he has some grad students, and the very, very young grad students, Charlie, so you know. So Dr. Beamish is an assistant professor of history at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He received his PhD in U.S. history from Johns Hopkins University. His research focuses on slavery in the South and specifically in the lower Mississippi Valley. He is currently interested in the public history of slavery in Louisiana, and before coming to Louisiana, he taught at universities in Maryland, Pennsylvania, Canada, and currently he resides in Lafayette. So if we could please give Dr. Beamish and his grad students a wonderful New Iberia warm welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having us. Can you all hear me now? Okay, great. So I'm going to introduce the students with me as we kind of move through the next 40 minutes or so. But briefly, we have Taylor Swear to my left, Travion Ambroise, and Emma Willis to my right. And I'll talk a little bit more about why there's four of us here instead of one person. I was asked a little while ago to give this talk. Originally, Dr. Phoebe Hayes was going to give a talk, and so it's helpful that it takes more than one of us to kind of fill her shoes. What we're going to talk about today is Reconstruction. So I know the intro suggested my specialty is the period of slavery, but we're going to look at the period after that. How many of you here are familiar with what Reconstruction was? Majority, slight majority. So Reconstruction is usually taken to be the period between the end of the Civil War in 1865-ish and the point in 1877 or so when the United States withdraws the U.S. military from the South. And in between, in this 12-year period, there are an enormous number of changes happening within the southern United States, including Louisiana, right? So after the southern states are defeated in the Civil War, the big question facing not just Louisiana, not just the South, but the entire country is, what does a rebellious state within your own borders look like after the rebellion is over, right? Do you try people for treason? Do you try to reconcile as quickly as possible? You have largely outlawed the institution of slavery, except to this day where it's still legal in prisons. But the economy is still centered on cash crops. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in this period that is being worked out. And in the initial period, it's being worked out by the federal government, making choices and requiring those choices to be implemented through the use of the United States Army to allow things like voting rights for African Americans, citizenship rights, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm going to do today is I'll talk for a few minutes about what the rest of a standard narrative of Reconstruction in the southern United States would be. And then we'll spend most of our time complicating that and talking about why that isn't really the case a lot of places, and it definitely wasn't the case in Iberia Parish, right? So if you've gotten a high school history version or even a university textbook version of Reconstruction, it might not actually be too much like what happened here in New Iberia. So one of the key sets of players in this struggle for the future of the South is formerly enslaved people. There's about 4 million people who have freed themselves from the institution of bondage during this Civil War period. About 200,000 of those fought in the United States Army, the Union. Close to 40,000 of those veterans died on the battlefield or in the course of their service. And now these individuals were armed with freedom, but in many cases not with property. So for many, this was insufficient, right? One black union veteran says, if I cannot do like a white man, I am not free, right? Demanding legal equality, demanding the right to property, all sorts of things like this. And to kind of try and answer these questions, the president at the time, as the Civil War is starting to end, is familiar to many of you, I'm sure, Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln's Reconstruction, which may be less familiar to you, as we know he's assassinated right as this is starting to take off, is actually very palatable to the white South. He offers very generous terms to the defeated Confederacy and asks very little of the Confederacy in order to rejoin the U.S. Basically just saying, we want to be part of the U.S. again, and having only 10% of the number of voters say that they'd be loyal to the U.S. government, right? This seems pretty moderate after you've fought the deadliest war in U.S. history against this group. But as this is starting to happen, Lincoln, as we know, visits Ford's Theater. He's assassinated, and there will be a new president, and more importantly, a new Congress. And the new Congress will be filled with people we call radical Republicans. Ignore the term Republican, right? Political parties of that time have no bearing on political parties of today in terms of orientation or anything. But essentially, these people in Congress decide there needs to be a more punitive solution to the people who have fought against the United States. At the same time, there start to be major pushes to create new economic, social, and political institutions in the South, right? Most famously through the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a Washington, D.C. based organization that sets up schools for formerly enslaved people, banking institutions, and so on throughout the South. At the same time, a series of 3 Reconstruction amendments, the 13th through 15th, passed through Congress and the presidency, right? The 13th famously ends slavery, and as I mentioned, leaves this notable exception that exists to this day to allow slavery in prisons. And the 14th and 15th deal with voting and citizenship rights and so on. After Lincoln leaves office, I guess is a euphemistic way of saying it, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who's openly hostile to formerly enslaved people, takes office and starts to battle with his own Congress. In the end, he largely loses out to his Congress. The U.S. government divides the South from states into military districts to be governed by the U.S. Army. And over the next decade or so, from 1865 to 1875 or so, it's a struggle between people who often identify themselves as redeemers or home rulers, white Southerners seeking to retain or regain political control of the South, and the elected officials of the South, who in many states, such as Louisiana, are majority black for some periods of Reconstruction. So that's the standard narrative. From 1865 to 1877, it starts out with the U.S. government imposing legal equality, regardless of race, and using the force of the U.S. Army to do so. Over time, the American public, especially the white public, starts to tire in their minds of the race issue, starts to not be very committed to enforcing equality in the South, and by 1877, the United States withdraws all military forces from the South. Basically, you don't need to know the details, obviously, but based on a bargain between the two major parties for who gets the presidency, they trade a contested presidential election for ending Reconstruction. So here's one narrative, right? That Reconstruction offers a moment of something, not equality, but pushing towards equality regardless of race, that is eventually defeated by national politics and a lack of commitment by white America. This is accurate in a general sense, but it also puts a lot of agency, a lot of the who's doing things, in the hands of the US government and the US military. And this might be familiar to you, right? I don't know exactly what the stories circulating in New Iberia are, but in a lot of places in this region more generally, we have a lot of stories of the Union Army arriving at plantations and enslaved people flocking to the Union commanders to join, right? But this isn't really what happens. It's much more active on the part of enslaved people at the time, right? You hear news, they hear news that the Union Army is 40 miles away, or way down the Teche, or something like this. And they make massive efforts to escape and free themselves by joining the Union Army. And so it's important for us to think about things in different ways than our textbooks might offer. And one different interpretation that fits a little bit better with the evidence we see in New Iberia and Iberia Parish more broadly is one advanced way back in 1935 by a guy you may have heard of, W.E.B. Du Bois. And this man, W.B. Du Bois, was one of the sort of key leading African-American thinkers of the 20th century. He's relevant from almost the start of the century through the 1960s, and his ideas have remained central since then. But one of his most important ideas, or at least if you talk to a historian like me, is his massive reinterpretation of what happened during the end of the Civil War and the start of Reconstruction. And for Du Bois, the war was not ended by the US Army or the Union or by Abraham Lincoln. For him, it was ended by what he calls the general strike. And what Du Bois means when he refers to the general strike at the end of the Civil War into Reconstruction is a refusal of enslaved people to continue laboring, a massive concerted effort to escape plantations and other forms of bondage, to join the US military or otherwise withhold their labor. And historians since then have started to agree with this and see that in many ways the Confederacy was crippled from the inside just as quickly as it was from the outside on the battlefield. So what does all this mean for New Iberia? So about 2 years ago, Dr. Phoebe Hayes, myself, and Ms. Shaylin Woods over there, who's the director of the Ernest Gaines Center at the University of Louisiana, started talking about a project we could do together as public history. And public history just simply means history outside of the boundaries of your university or high school classroom, right? And Dr. Hayes had said, there's a long history of Black veterans in Iberia Parish that hasn't really been discussed or recognized a great deal. And we started to think, well, maybe we should do a research project involving people from Iberia Parish and the university on this. And we quickly realized this was too big a project, right? And we would have to start to narrow this down. So what we narrowed it down to was something relatively seemingly small. We were going to look over the course of a year plus at what role Black veterans of the Union Army during the Civil War played in building and rebuilding Iberia Parish and New Iberia after the Civil War. And we ended up with a group of, I think, 67 people that we'd found and Dr. Hayes had found in the records. And we sort of have spent the past few months tracing these individuals who served in the Union Army and then came back to help shape New Iberia and Iberia Parish more broadly to see what exactly Reconstruction, this 10-year period, looked like if we don't just look at a textbook, right? If we don't just look at a newspaper, and what we look at is actually the lived experiences of, in this case, 67 people spread across more or less a parish. I say more or less because Iberia Parish as a parish isn't founded until a couple years after the Civil War, so we have a period where it's split between different parishes. And so what I want to do with the rest of our time is give a few minutes each to the three students who are here with me today to talk a little bit about some of the things they've found that are specific stories or general themes about what happened in this period that we've found over the past few months. And then we can also spend some time opening it up to questions and answers. our database includes, we've found by working with people in Iberia Parish, anytime we research a veteran, there's about a 20% chance that Dr. Hayes or somebody, knows them or has a relative or something like this, right? So a lot of family names come up, and there's a lot of kind of history there. So I have a few other things I could say, but for now, I think I'm going to leave it to our researchers here, and we'll start with Travian Ambroise, and then Emma Willis, and finish with Taylor Swear.
Hi everybody, can everyone hear me? All right. So I'm Travian Ambrose. I'm a senior history major at UO. And what I'm going to talk to you all about is geography. And so first and foremost, New Iberia, or Iberia Parish as in general, was founded in 1868. So in that knowledge, in that awareness of 1868, Iberia Parish is fixated in the narrative of Reconstruction. Before that, Iberia Parish was actually split into what we call St. Martin Parish and St. Mary Parish. The line kind of went somewhere half, directly in the half of what we call New Iberia today. And so in that, born in 1868, Iberia Parish is there. In that consciousness, in that awareness, you have free people who are now free, or enslaved people who are now free, thinking about the ways in which they can interact within the space that is this new parish. Of course, there's a long narrative and stories that speak about their identity and how they fix themselves in this place during Reconstruction. One of these narratives, of course, is about the Wakefields and their rise in political office and how they navigated spaces, the establishments of institutions like Howe, which was an all-black school, and building those educational spaces as well. Churches, another one, avenues and spaces of rewards of congregating, but also serving not just simply as places to worship, the spaces to organize, to socialize, and also to gather. And so these spaces were sacred. And so all of this is happening before the formal period of Jim Crow, which begins in 1898 in Louisiana. In this context, we're looking at the geography that is Iberia Parish today. And so within the lives of the veterans that we're speaking about with our project, it's looking at the places that they live, that they call home. And so Iberia Parish, there are plenty of communities that we know of today, but also there are plenty of communities that no longer exist or whose names have changed in a sense. But New Iberia, of course, is New Iberia today. And this awareness, it's to think about New Iberia in a sense of people coming into this city in regards of what the city offered. So in the sense, 1870s, you see the railroad being built and how that brought people to the railroad. You needed labor, but also you needed people to organize around the railroad, right? And so thinking about what did the railroad bring to New Iberia as well. You see communities beginning to develop, or communities continue to develop in regards of the awareness of spaces. So if you look at New Iberia today, so for example, downtown Iberia, which is around St. James Methodist Church, one of the oldest black churches in Iberia Parish, you see a community being developed and continuing to be developed within that area. The land of which where the Wheat's land holding was, so the Shadows is home today, you see a community developing there as well. Additionally, on Main Street, as we look at the history of Reconstruction and the eras after Reconstruction, we see a history of African Americans owning businesses on Main Street. But once again, this is very much important to think about those spaces and what these spaces meant. Safety. These spaces meant community. These spaces meant social life. These spaces were in a sense, in conjunction to the system or the order that would be or apartheid known as Jim Crow in the American South. And so thinking about all those layers and all those contexts, you have to think about these geographies as spaces where people live, but also where people found safety, communicate, and gather, just as we do today. And so thinking about spaces outside of the Iberia, we see an identification of Bell Place, right, as a community where people were living. Bell Place historically was a site of an enslaved, of a forced labor complex, or what we call today a plantation. In that context, African Americans who are now free continue to live in those spaces, but why would they continue to live in those spaces, right? Everyone couldn't go off the plantation. Access was different. Access to capital was different. Access to land was different, right? And so in that, you see that identification of that space, continuing to live in it, but also forming a community of their own in that sense. Additionally, you see Lorville, or what it was called back then, Falls Point, and that area identifying as another area where African Americans were living and continuing to define themselves in regards to building churches and communities and forming organizations or some social groups or social links. Moving out from the Falls Point area, the Lorville area, you see Morbihan, another community, another area that people do not know much of today, but in regards of where that located is. So think about, for those of us who are here, Caribbean Ice, that's Morbihan-ish, kind of, and so that area, thinking about those spaces of those areas as well. Moving from, or down the bayou, I should say, another place is Olivier. Now Olivier, not that many people know of Olivier today, but in regards of kind of looking at where it is today, for those of you who are living, we're kind of near Dornell Road, Old Spanish Trail, where that bridge is, that's Olivier in a sense. And so thinking about those spaces where people are living and how that is being changed. Once again, Olivier is a site of a forced labor complex, or known as plantation. How those spaces are changing in Reconstruction, how people are living in these spaces, defining themselves in regards to the structure that are existing in Reconstruction and the years after. Now, of course, moving from there are a lot of other places, but one part or one place that I must mention, that being especially tell everyone about it, of course, is of course Nicotown, and the story of African Americans owning land and forming a small community in New Iberia. So Nicotown was a farming community, sugarcane growing community, in regards to the Manuel family and a lot of other families. Nico is the name of Nicotown. Forming these smaller communities within New Iberia, within Iberia Parish. That's rural, but also, once again, focused on what their values were, right? Forming those communities, those safety nets within the context that was the late 1800s and the 1900s. Additionally, you're looking also in Nicotown positioning to Patuga, another site of forced labor complex, and thinking about those histories in which people, once again, moving these spaces, schools being established, churches being built, how are they living within these communities and forming these social networks? And of course, additionally, thinking about those who are living on the islands, right, the so-called islands, Avery Island and Weeks Island, and their identities. Because once again, though Avery Island today is known for Tabasco and Weeks is salt mine, these islands were once communities where people lived, had lives, went to school, like we all do today, go to church, form social networks, have some businesses, maybe businesses that we can identify, but also businesses that may have happened under the books. But definitely these spaces existed, and within the lives of the veterans, we see, once again, that identification of community by them continuing to live either somewhere near people who they serve alongside, or moving into new neighborhoods that were once again building up in regards of the time span of Reconstruction and the decades after.
I think this leads really well into the next little talk we're going to have from Eva, and then Trey's highlighted for us the communities, many of which were influenced, shaped, and formed by veterans returning from the Civil War. And Eva's going to talk to us a little bit, I believe, about the military service of the veterans during the war itself that maybe created some of these social bonds that came back to New Iberia with them.
Right, thank you. So one of the first things we noticed with the list that Dr. Hayes gave us was that a lot of these men served in the same regiments and furthermore in the same companies, which that's a really big bond that can form between people. And one of the things that we noticed as well was that, let's see, what is it? The 25th Corps d'Afrique kind of changed names a couple of times. It was the 25th, then it was the 93rd, then it was the 81st. It was the same group of men, though. And we noticed that these men had the same names. Their names just kept coming up over and over again. Corporal Samuel Brown, Celestin Cass, Charles Handy, Harrison Hines, Washington Moore, Rutledge Flood, John Jack, and Peter Jenkins. So we decided to look into the actual activities that this regiment would have gotten into as like during the war itself. And as we know, most of war isn't actually fighting; it's just kind of being stationed places. So we learned that the 81st Regiment in particular was stationed in New Orleans for a portion of the war, and they took up jobs there. They guarded buildings there. And we also learned that black men weren't afforded the opportunity to become officers in the war. So these men, there was a shortage of officers in these regiments. But even then, whenever the 81st Regiment in particular was inspected, they found that this regiment was just particularly well behaved. Not well behaved. They were really organized. So we extrapolated from that that there was a level of leadership that happened among the men themselves, where their officers were not around, they were absent, but these men took up leadership positions within the regiment. And as Travion discussed, they took that leadership home with them, and they formed communities around these bonds that they made.
So far we've gotten a bit, hopefully, of a picture of the spaces and some of the sort of social bonds that at least the men who served are. One of the gaps in our research that we're hoping to address in the future, we're hoping to this semester but haven't gotten to it right, is families, women, children, people who were helping with these efforts in building Iberia Parish that didn't serve in the war, and, which is obviously limited to men. But it's also important for us to see individual stories, I think, to start to think about people not just as one person in a company or a regiment or a place. And so Taylor is going to tell us about one of the 67 individuals that we read.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay, hi. Sorry about that. So I'm going to talk about one of the veterans that I was assigned to research. We were given a list from Dr. Hayes, and in it had the list of veterans and usually a little bit of information about them. For this particular individual, Joseph Johnson, I was given his company and regiments that he served under. And when I started researching him, I got a little concerned that I wouldn't find enough information because Joseph Johnson is a very common name. So I had to start going through each individual pension card associated with a Joseph Johnson until I was able to match up his company and regiment. Once I did that, I learned that his name actually changed. He was now going by Scott Johnson. From there, I was able to find out that he was born in about 1845 in Alabama. He married Millie Kelly in about 1878, and they had 10 children. And he worked as a farmer. What was most interesting about Joseph, now known as Scott, was that he died February 10th, 1910 in Orleans Parish, which meant that his death certificate was digitized. And so I was able to find his death certificate, which showed that he died of enteritis, which was basically an intestinal type disease. The death certificate was written in both English and French, and the fact that it was written in English and French talks a lot about what was happening in Orleans Parish at the time, and the fact that his cause of death, enteritis, was related to an epidemic that was going through the nation at the time of deaths between the 1910s and 1930s. But what turned out to be the most interesting about Joseph, now known as Scott Johnson, was that I was able to find a photograph that is associated with him. So the photograph is circulating, and it's got 5 soldiers posed staring at the camera. And what we know from the work that the previous groups have done is that Joseph served with Henry Grant in the 98th, which was created by the 4th Corps d'Afrique, which means he could have served with other veterans, Nicholas Coleman, Francis Johnny, Alphonse Manuel, or Odilon Manuel. And there was also the possibility that he served with Jean-Louis. So having that photograph with those 5 individuals, we're not able to say exactly which one is Joseph Johnson, but we are able to say that he is one of the soldiers' photographs, and most likely there are some other veterans that we have been studying about in this class that are in the photograph with him. So he started out the hardest to find information of and ended up providing one of the richer stories of the veterans researched.
Okay, thank you all. And this is just a tiny sort of sliver of what we've been finding over the past semester. There's about 15 student researchers, along with myself, Ms. Woods and Mr. Richardson in the first row there, working on this project. And the end goal of the project, some, months from now, probably in around December, is that we will have an actual physical archive space in New Iberia, not sponsored by, that is the archive space of the Iberia African American Historical Society. And it'll be a place where people can go and research if they have any ancestors who may have served. There'll be a ton of information on all 67 of these veterans, in addition to hopefully more individuals as this project expands. So we have lots to look forward to there. There'll also hopefully be a symposium in May where we go into detail about some of these veterans somewhere here at Iberia Parish. So this is just kind of a start, and we wanted to kind of give you a sense, both in the spirit of what Dr. Hayes was going to talk about Reconstruction, about what was happening here in the 1860s and 70s, but also to give you a sense of what we hope will be an exciting project going forward in the region. So we have, I don't know how long we have, a few minutes maybe, before people have to get set up for the next talk. So I imagine we have a few minutes for question and answer. If any of you have either general questions about what we're doing, questions about this time period, questions about any individuals, anything along these lines, myself or any of the students, I'm sure, would be happy to answer them.
So it is known that formerly enslaved African Americans from the Union came back home and they built communities on each other. Was it common for them to come back with other officers that were with them? And the communities, if possible, were centered around their experience inside the military.
I don't have any specific names on me, unfortunately, but we did notice while we were combing through the census records that we would see the same names in, specifically next to each other in neighborhoods. So I think it's pretty safe to say that people did form communities around this shared experience. So it looks like, yeah, they were neighbors. And I think, what was it? Ward 3 specifically had a lot of veterans living in it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and to add a little bit more, I mean, you see that, for example, I said Bell Place, Patuville is another one that you see repeatedly in the census. Ilpicon, which is an area that we no longer call today, but essentially it's kind of the Port of Iberia Parish that's very close to the Gulf of Mexico. Another place, it's Ward 6, or City Ward 6 of New Iberia. And so City Ward 6, depending on the census, included but also did not include Little Brooklyn, which is on the other side of the bayou, but also parts of the West End. And so kind of thinking about how those different enumerated districts or those city wards changed over time, you see once again those names being repeated, those places being repeated, and we kind of can draw some clues that they knew each other definitely in this context, and also kind of were around each other definitely.
Thank you.
And I had a question. Y'all mentioned the spaces a lot and how the people were able to form unities over there. I was curious about the people, like specifically the white people that would come into these communities, how it affected them when their spaces would maybe be disrupted because these people needed to move here or they needed to live here, or maybe just not white people, just other ethnicities, like when we have an influx of immigrants or Asian Americans or anybody would just move into these communities that would come into the spaces, how it impacted the African American communities that were living there.
And so definitely that speaks about, once again, that experience about space and the changing of space and population coming into it. And so once again, it's very important to remember, Reconstruction and the periods following Reconstruction were a violent time, a very violent time. New Iberia is not an exception. It's very much so in the history in regards of an expulsion happening in 1889. A violent expulsion following the lynching of 2 individuals, and then the attack on the African American community within New Iberia. And so within that, you see that place and those spaces kind of being defined and pushed, right? And how people were being curtailed in regards of attacking particular individuals. Like, for example, the preacher of St. Paul's, well, we know St. Paul's Congregational today, but St. Paul's a long time ago was another congregational church, similar congregation, but different building, right? But their first pastor, or one of their earlier pastors, was one of those individuals who had to flee New Iberia. And he was also very much responsible for how being established at that time. And so once again, thinking about how institutions were being attacked during this period as well. And so when we're looking at the long history of these communities, you can see, once again, that influence and different perspectives and different ideas introducing into these communities. So for example, a little brief one, the West End, right? The West End today is predominantly an African-American community, but it also has a lot of Lao and Asian Americans living in the community as well. And thinking about, once again, all of those people moving into those areas. But back in the 1900s, it also was another community as well, with African Americans, Lebanese, people who you may consider or Acadian or descend from Acadians living in those communities as well. So these communities weren't monolithic at all, and these experiences weren't monolithic at all. We can't generalize the experiences, but we can learn from where they lived, how they interacted, some spaces that they formed, and how they connected themselves with New Iberia and Iberia Parish and Louisiana in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to kind of underline what Travion was saying here, that the level of violence is not something we emphasized in our talk because that tends to get a lot of attention. But Louisiana, especially South Louisiana, was one of the most violent places in the country during this period. And it's also important to emphasize the degree of upheaval that was happening across the South at the neighborhood level. Everything was completely in turmoil as people had been going off to join the Army, the Union Army, escaping from plantations, white families also relocating to a certain extent. So the world that people would come back to in 1865, in some ways you could see people being intruders and attacked in neighborhoods, but in some ways and sometimes the neighborhoods almost didn't exist that they were coming back to, depending on where specifically they were going to. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Oh, we've got one in the back, front, and then over there.
This is such important research. Congratulations to y'all. You've said this in so many ways, but I'm just struck. These men were coming back in their own communities as victors. They had been part of the Union Army, but they were living in a broader community that saw them probably as enemy combatants. Have you been able to reflect on or find any information on that?
We have. We're always
Thank you.
trying to be like a little sensitive about how we present that information instead of just dropping it in. But I mean, I can remember one moment in class when we were doing research on one veteran, and we found out unexpectedly to us that he had been targeted and lynched. We don't know if it was specifically because of his veteran status or other reasons, but there's a lot of research showing that Black Union veterans were actually targeted more so than almost anyone else. It's unclear if that was because of their veteran status or because if they're more likely to be in leadership positions, combinations of those things probably. So yeah, we have certainly found people paid a real price for that at times. Is there anything anyone wanted to add to that?
I'm interested in the issue of land and how that changed. I'm interested in the issue of land and how that changed over time. Someone mentioned on the panel that property rights were denied, among other things, to Black people, but they seem particularly important. I know the 40 acres and a mule special field order that was issued right before the end of the Civil War was generally believed to be a promise to all formerly enslaved people. Some 40,000 formerly enslaved people and did get land for a time before that order was rescinded in the East.
Yeah.
What was that like here? And I know in the eastern part of the United States, southeast, a lot of formerly enslaved people believed that, yes, this was a permanent thing, they were going to get it. Did that reach here? Did people believe that? And if so, did some people get land here? And did they lose it? And the ones who were able to get land that you talked about, I think someone mentioned farming, that they farmed. How did they get that land, and was the family able to hold on to it? And if not, why not?
So I can give a bit of a general historical overview, and then I don't know if our future city planner has some thoughts on this, but so what's being referred to here in the eastern United States is in the South Carolina Sea Islands. General Sherman, who's a famous or infamous, depending on who you ask, Union general, issues a special field order, essentially an emergency ruling, in which he appropriates confiscated land from enslavers and redistributes it to enslaved people who had worked on that land. And this is where the idea of 40 acres and a mule comes from. There's no actual mule in this field order. But before too much happens there, you couldn't look it up. There's a book called The Port Royal Experiment if you want to read about it. But read about it. Is Lincoln quickly countermands, as you mentioned, this order and seizes the land, like says, we're not doing this. This is not what we're interested in. In terms of does that filter back to Iberia Parish, I think by the time the war is over, the specifics of 40 acres are known not to be true, but it's in flux what will happen, right? So they don't think specifically the terms of special field order are going to come, but there are a lot of different ideas and demands about what will happen with land ownership.
And I mean, and definitely when we're thinking about land within the context, very much so similar to today, but we can think about land back then in regards of what did land mean, right? Land meant, in a sense, sustainability, but also in a sense, in a broader sense, for the freed people and their descendants, self-determinism, right? The idea to set your own schedule, to live by your own means, to form your own land, to work on your own land, to do it on your own, right, with your family, of course, but in regards of self-determination. And so in Iberia Parish, and of course in South Louisiana, and of course the United States in general, you do see black land ownership, right? There is a long history of black land ownership following the end of Reconstruction. Well, some would say in the period of Reconstruction, but also into the eras after. But at the same time, and I believe it's like once you get to the early 1900s, you see a sharp decline. And so that regards of ways in which certain individuals were able to undermine the system, or in a sense, gain the system by taking the land back in regards of mechanisms within the legal system, within the tax system, and et cetera, how to take the land back in regards of taking the land back and then moving that idea of self-determination behind. And so within this context, in Iberia Parish, we do see black sugarcane farmers, and we still do see black sugarcane farmers in Southwest Louisiana. But their history, and if you speak to them, do speak about that experience of being denied farming loans to farm sugarcane, being denied those experiences and the land being taken away, and how they were able to keep their land, right? It speaks about those varying experiences. If you know a black sugarcane farmer, ask them, right? Think about those experiences and listen from their experiences. I know I have them in my family, and hearing their story, how the land came into my family, and how they were able to keep it, definitely speaks about those experiences. But also within my family, there are histories of the land being taken away. And so how did that happen? Definitely asking those questions. And of course, a lot of those are found in the clerk of court records in regards of court cases and et cetera.
Yeah, and this is a really important, long-lasting issue as well, as Travion said. This is not just an issue from the 1860s and 70s, and it's one that has a very close history, even at a national level, to this region. So if you jump ahead 100 years from the 1860s and 70s that we're looking at to the 1960s and 70s, there's a group called that you may have heard of, the Southern Federation of Cooperatives, which is dedicated to working with black businesses and black land ownership to retain it. And it's a nationally known organization if you read books on land ownership and so on, but it's a group that comes out of the Lafayette area and is started by a man named Charles Prejean, who's from this area, and some of his family members work in it as well. So this is a very important history that has a long story. I think there's often this idea that there's land that black families acquire right after Reconstruction that's taken away. But actually, as Trayvon presented, it's somewhere between 1914 and 1920 that black agricultural land ownership peaks around 15% of agricultural land in the United States. Today, it's below 2%. It's below 1.5%, actually. So these are narratives that show up in this time period, but that, like much history, has contemporary resonance as well.
Because of all your interest here today, you may also want to consider becoming a member of the Iberia African American Historical Society. It is through their work, begun by Phoebe Hayes, that all of this true history is coming out. It only costs $20 a year, and I'm sure that y'all can look that up online, or we have members who might be able to help you sign up or find out how to do that.
Thank you. I saw another hand up front here. Yeah.
Regarding Mr. Johnson, do you have any idea what he was doing between the end of the Civil War and when he died in Orleans Parish? Census records often indicate an occupation. Most people were farming, but what was he doing?
So for Mr. Johnson, I do have that he was a farmer. I didn't bring my whole research packet, but he was working as a farmer. And he was living in Iberia Parish at the time. He did die in Orleans Parish, but then was buried in Jeanerette. So he was in Iberia Parish and was ended up coming back for his burial. But he was definitely a farmer. Most of the ones I ended up researching were farmers or gardeners. I did have one veteran who owned a farm, and I think the last census of his was 1910, and he was still owning that farm.
Since I have the mic, I'll ask one other real quick question. I was once asked on a plane if I was familiar with the Freetown area in Iberia Parish. And I said I was aware that there was one in Lafayette, called by that name, but I wasn't aware of one here. But I got home, I asked around, and some of them said that it was the Nico Town area, it was Freetown. Which I didn't know before. So I got an education on an airplane.
Well, and the thing about free towns, it's a term that means a lot. There's a lot of free towns. And Iberia Parish is none different. There are a lot of free towns. So for example, Brooklyn was also known as Freetown. Koto, if you look at, there's a Freetown Road in Koto. That was also another Freetown. You can also say Olivier, part of it was a Freetown. And then Miko Town, another Freetown. So there was a lot of usage of the term Freetown, which basically meant that this was an enclave of free people and who were living kind of in a sense in a rural setting. Usually you see it in a rural setting. Now that's not to say that it's exclusively rural, as we can see in Lafayette, it's still within that context of the formal city. So in that, Freetown means a lot, and also very different in regards of different places around the United States.
I think we missed a question up front here, maybe.
Thank you. Hello? Yeah. Excuse me, sir, in the blue suit. I heard you mention earlier, you were talking about the predominantly black communities, like in the West End, where they might have like a mixed bag of people of sorts. I want to know how the race relations kind of went about going from Reconstruction into Jim Crow, and you had said something about a monolithic experience. I kind of want to know what you meant by that.
So monolithic means that we can't say that there is one experience, right? That every experience of everyone who lived within those communities were the same. As we know, living in today, where we live doesn't mean that everyone looks the same or thinks the same, right? there's different layers to that experience. So I can live on one side of the street and my neighbor can live on the other side of the street. It doesn't mean that we have the same experience or the same view of the world. Rather, it means that we have different layers of that human experience that we all kind of share together. But also the fact that when we're looking at the West End, particularly that Hopkins Street area, that was a commercial district in the 1940s and 1950s and well into the 60s about business owners owning businesses, running businesses. There was doctor's offices until the 1940s. But once again, thinking about those spaces, not everyone's experience was the same in these communities. You had people who were middle class, people who were not in the middle class within these communities, but those are terminologies that we use today. But thinking about those experiences, when we look at them all together, we can kind of, in a sense, look at that pattern of how people identified within those spaces that we consider today, the West End or downtown or Bell Place, etc., to get a bigger picture of the place, of the history of Iberia Parish, definitely.
So I know you mentioned a lot about black land ownership and kind of like self-determination during the Reconstruction era, but I was wondering if sharecropping was very prominent in New Iberia, and if so, where were these areas where sharecropping was prominent, and how did that affect the people under sharecropping?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like two axes to think this long. One is chronological, which I can speak to, and another is geographical, which maybe someone else here can speak to. So chronologically, I think people tend to think sharecropping happens like as soon as the Civil War ends. That tends not to be the case. Originally, the first kind of things happening are laws that are passed, very sort of draconian laws requiring formerly enslaved people or black people, the terminology will vary by place, to have work for certain periods. They tend to be vagrancy laws, but in effect, because of the type of work available, requires people to stay on plantations, right? And those laws end up shifting a little bit towards things more like what you might almost think of as a company town or a plantation town, where this can coincide with sharecropping, where there's a store that is basically the only access to funds or credit. Sometimes it goes so far as to have what they would call plantation or company scrip, basically people getting paid in dollars, unique dollars only redeemable at that one place, which will have, inflated prices and things like that. And then there's a series of different systems to try and force labor in different ways. And it's really by the 1880s and 90s that sharecropping or the crop lien system starts to take over, where it's using credit based on the crop. In terms of the specifics of New Iberia, I'm not sure if anybody has thoughts on that, about if there's locations.
Well, I mean, when we're thinking about it, we can also think of, in a sense, of some of these communities that were called free towns, right? Olivier is one of those communities that, in a sense, was a plantation town, where everyone's whole identity or space, not identity, but their whole lived experience, their built environment, was within that confined area of Olivier. And so these examples can be placed everywhere, in a sense. Going to St. Martin Parish, there's one used to be called St. John. And so when you think of those names, or when those names call to mind, you see people living within those senses, within quarters. Within quarters, sometimes brick, just depends on the place. And their whole life is, in a sense, very much confined to that area in regards of working, in this context of Iberia Parish, working at the sugar mill, working in the field, working in the house, and how those different ports were designated. But once again, those experiences, I mean, there's a group of recordings beyond the veil, or behind the veil, that was recorded by the Duke University. And when they came to New Iberia, they recorded some of these recordings. And it's available for everyone, so if you want to look it up, Behind the Veil at Duke University. There are some individuals who are telling their own histories who actually have had this experience working in these contexts, working in these places as sugarcane farmers within that experience as well.
And I can't get into really details because it's not decided, but there is a decent chance that the next collaboration between UL Public History and the Iberia African American Historical Society will perhaps center on these questions. So that's kind of up in the air. I think we're running up against our time. Am I right there? Okay, so if we have a last question, maybe we could take one more.
So you were previously talking about how communities were built on former plantation sites and how fixed environments were between these people. I was wondering how the culture in the area developed and how the influence of immigrants in the area, how it affected the culture, the mindset, and the businesses in the area.
That's a really good question. It's one that we don't have a complete answer to yet in our project. We have suggestive, I think, ideas we can speak to a little bit. One of the things is if we had extended our work past the 1870s, and moved outside, especially of focusing on Civil War veterans, I think we might have captured different kinds of immigration, right? Especially to South Louisiana. Both directly from East Asia, especially China, and indirectly via Cuba. There's a lot of forced labor immigration to the sugar areas. We haven't done a lot with that. There's a good book, if you're interested in it, by a guy named Moon Ho Jung, who's a fairly well-known historian, who's written a book on Asian labor in late 19th century South Louisiana. In terms of migration from other parts of the U.S., we've done definitely some work with that. Are you in that group? With the migration from other parts of the U.S.? Do you want to add to that?
I'm also part of a group. I didn't actually talk about our research today, but we are looking at enlistment places for veterans from our list. So the 67 veterans, we're trying to find out whether they were born in Louisiana and enlisted in Louisiana and then moved back to Louisiana, or if they were born elsewhere, enlisted elsewhere, and then settled here. And so we're still getting our stuff together, but we do have some veterans who were born and enlisted in like New York who ended up in Iberia Parish. So we do have some movement, but I think 40 of the veterans were born, enlisted, and came back to live here. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for our sample, we don't see a ton of migration or immigration to this area, but we're looking at Black Civil War veterans from 1860s and 70s. So we have a really sort of self-selected sample there. Like I said, more broadly, the major immigration in this period from outside of the country is from Asia, both directly and via Cuba, which had started that practice earlier. And that actually starts in places like Texas as early as the 1840s. In Louisiana, it's really more the 1860s it happens. But yeah, and then after the 1870s, there's obviously more of an expansion, but a lot of it centers on New Orleans and kind of radiates out for the other countries. Okay, well, thank you all for your questions. We really appreciate all of your engagement as well as your patience, and thank you to our researchers here.